My name is Brandon Cole. I am 34 years old, and I have been working overtime all week fixing network issues at the office. By Friday, I was looking forward to nothing more than a quiet evening at home. My job as an information technology systems technician is not glamorous, but it pays the bills and keeps me busy. I spend most days dealing with crashed servers, password resets, and people who swear they did not change anything right before everything breaks. I had already decided on my drive home that I was going to heat up some leftovers, take a hot shower, and fall asleep in front of the television. What I did not expect was to walk into a house that felt like a war zone the second I opened the front door. Alicia was pacing around the living room like a caged animal when I walked in. Her rich brown skin was flushed, her curly hair was pulled out of its usual neat bun and frizzing around her face, and she had that look in her eyes that usually meant trouble was coming. The blinds were half closed, the television was off, and the whole room had this tense, electric silence to it. I set my laptop bag down by the door and tried to read the room, forcing my voice to stay even. I said, "Rough day." She stopped pacing and turned to face me, her jaw set. She said, "We need to talk." Those 4 words never lead anywhere good in a marriage, and every nerve in my body knew it. I loosened my tie, trying to keep my breathing steady, and sat down on the couch. I motioned toward the armchair across from me, but she stayed standing, arms folded tightly across her chest. I said, "All right, what is on your mind?" She exhaled sharply and gestured between us, as if the air itself offended her. She said, "This is not working. This whole thing. Us. Our marriage." I had been sensing the tension building for months, tiny comments here and there, long silences at dinner, the way she rolled her eyes when I talked about work. But hearing it said out loud still caught me off guard, like somebody had punched the air out of my chest. I said, "Okay, what specifically is not working for you?" "Everything," she exploded, her voice rising. She started pacing again, bare feet sliding over the rug. She said, "You come home, we eat dinner, we watch television, we go to bed. Then we wake up and do it all over again. Rinse and repeat. Where's the excitement? Where's the passion?" I leaned back and studied her face, trying to separate the emotion from anything useful underneath. I said, "So, you want more excitement?" She said, "I want to feel alive again." Her voice grew louder as she worked herself up. She said, "I want to feel like I did when I was younger, like when I was with someone who actually made me feel special." A cold weight settled in my stomach. I said, "Someone like who?" Even as I asked, I already knew where this was heading. Her dark eyes flashed with something between anger and desperation. She said, "Someone like Maurice." There it was. Maurice King, her high school boyfriend. The golden boy quarterback who, according to Alicia, could have gone anywhere and done anything. I had heard plenty about Maurice over the years, usually when she had too much wine and started reminiscing about how wild and free she used to be. We would be at some cookout with family from our black church community, and she would slip his name into stories more often than made sense. I repeated his name calmly. I said, "Maurice." She said, "Yes, Maurice." He knew how to make a woman feel wanted. He had ambition. He had dreams. He was not content to just coast through life like some people. That last part was clearly aimed at me. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice level, refusing to give her the dramatic reaction she seemed to expect. I said, "And what does Maurice have to do with our marriage?" She crossed her arms and looked me straight in the eye, like she was daring me to challenge her. She said, "I made a mistake not marrying Maurice." The silence that followed was deafening, heavier than any argument we had ever had. She stood there breathing heavily like she had just confessed to a crime, which in a way she had. I stood up slowly and walked past her toward the kitchen, not trusting myself to stay that close and stay calm. She followed me, her footsteps quick and uneven on the hardwood floor, probably expecting me to yell, to beg, to fall apart. Instead of doing any of that, I walked to the junk drawer by the refrigerator, the one that held everything we never bothered to organize. Old keys, dead batteries, takeout menus, and random business cards we had collected over the years at community events and family gatherings. I started digging through the pile. Alicia watched me with narrowed eyes. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Looking for something." I kept searching as if I had all the time in the world. I said, You said you made a mistake not marrying Maurice. She lifted her chin. She said, that is right. I found what I was looking for, folded and yellowing at the edges, and pulled out an old piece of paper with a phone number written on it in neat cursive. I said, well, Maurice is easy to find. Her face went pale, the anger draining out and leaving fear behind. She said, what do you mean? I held up the paper and gave her a small, controlled smile. I said, I still have his mother's phone number. Loretta King. Remember her? Sweet lady. We met her at that barbecue the Parker family hosted 3 years ago. Alicia's voice dropped. She said, you would not. I said, well, not what? Call her. I pulled out my phone and started dialing the number from the paper. I said, why not? If you were so convinced Maurice was the one who got away, maybe we should see how he feels about it. She said, stop. But the edge was gone from her voice, replaced with a thin tremor of panic. The phone rang once, twice. A familiar voice answered, warm and slightly surprised. She said, hello. I said, hello, Miss King. This is Brandon Cole, the husband of your son Maurice's old girlfriend, Alicia. We met a few years back at the Parker barbecue. Loretta said, oh, yes, baby, I remember you. How are things? I took a breath and decided to be direct. I said, well, that is actually why I'm calling. My wife just told me she thinks she made a mistake not marrying Maurice. I thought you might have some insight into how Maurice feels about that. The pause on the other end of the line was long and telling. I stepped just far enough to the side that Alicia could not see my face, but I kept my eyes on her. When Loretta finally spoke, her voice had changed, gentler but firmer. Loretta said, oh my. Well, I hate to be the bearer of uncomfortable news, but Maurice has mentioned her over the years. He always said she was the biggest mistake of his life. I watched Alicia's lips part slightly, her shoulders stiffening. Loretta continued. In fact, whenever his friends ask him about past relationships, he warns them about her specifically. I kept my tone neutral. I said, is that so? Loretta said, oh yes. He said she was manipulative and always made him feel like he was not good enough. He told me just last Christmas that dodging that situation was the best thing that ever happened to him. I let that sink in for a second, watching Alicia's face go from pale to ashen, her eyes shining with sudden, stunned wetness. I said, well, that is certainly enlightening. Thank you for your honesty, Ms. King. She said, of course, dear. I hope everything works out for you both. I said goodbye and hung up. I set my phone down on the counter and looked at Alicia, who was now backing toward the hallway like she wanted to disappear. The confident woman who had been lecturing me about excitement and passion just minutes earlier was gone. In her place was someone small and shaken. I said, there you go. Mystery solved. Turns out Maurice does not share your romantic nostalgia. Without another word, she spun around and practically ran down the hallway. I heard the guest room door slam shut, followed by the sharp, unmistakable sound of the lock clicking. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, letting the quiet settle. Then I opened the refrigerator, grabbed a beer, and sat back down on the couch. For the first time in months, the house was completely quiet, and honestly, it felt pretty good. The guest room door stayed locked for the rest of the evening. I could hear her moving around in there, drawers opening, footsteps crossing the carpet, probably pacing again, but she did not come out, not even when the microwave beeped and the smell of leftover baked chicken filled the house. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a text from her. She wrote, we need to talk. I stared at it for a second, then typed back, guest room door seems to work both ways. I watched the 3 dots appear and disappear twice, and then vanish altogether. No response came. I turned the volume down on the television, let a movie play in the background, and sat there thinking about the years we had spent together, wondering how much of that time had been real and how much had just been her holding on to somebody else's shadow. The next morning, I got up early out of habit, even though it was Saturday, and made coffee like I always did. I showered, got dressed, and was sitting at the kitchen table reading the news on my phone when I heard the guest room door open. Alicia walked in wearing an oversized t-shirt and sweats, her hair wrapped in a scarf now. She looked like she had not slept much. Faint smudges sat under her eyes, and her face was puffy. She poured herself coffee with unsteady hands and stood there for a moment, staring at the mug. Then she said, good. You are up. Can we please discuss this like adults? I said, sure. What would you like to discuss? She sat down across from me, fingers wrapped around her mug like it was the only thing holding her together. She said, "You embarrassed me last night." I set my phone down and looked at her carefully. I said, "I embarrassed you?" She said, "Calling his mother like that, putting our business out there. That was cruel, Brandon." I shook my head slowly. I said, "You told me you made a mistake marrying me instead of another man. You called our marriage a mistake and held up Maurice as some lost dream. But somehow I am the one who should be embarrassed." She said, "That is not what I meant." I said, "That is exactly what you said, word for word." She looked down into her coffee. She said, "I was frustrated. I said things I did not mean." I said, "Which part did you not mean? The part about Maurice making you feel alive, or the part about me coasting through life?" She did not answer that. I took a breath and continued. I said, "Here's what I find interesting. You have been holding on to this fantasy about Maurice for years, always talking about how amazing he was, how he had such big dreams, but you never actually tried to contact him." Her head jerked up. She said, "That is not true." I said, "Is it not?" I pulled out my phone again, not because I enjoyed hurting her, but because I needed facts. I said, "You know what? I am curious now. Let's see what Maurice is up to these days." Her face drained of color again. She whispered, "Do not." But I was already opening the Facebook app and typing his name into the search bar. It took less than a minute to find him. Maurice King. Profile picture of him in a Navy suit. Maurice King. Living in Charlotte, North Carolina. Married to someone named Monica for 2 years. Working as a regional sales manager for a company called Harborview Medical Systems. I scrolled through his profile, my thumb steady. I said, "Look at that." I turned my phone so she could see. I said, "Maurice got married to someone who is not you. Interesting how he managed to find excitement and passion with someone else." She stared at the screen, and I could see her hands trembling slightly where they gripped her mug. I said, "Want to see something else interesting?" I scrolled through his photos. Maurice at his wedding, smiling at a beautiful dark-skinned woman in a lace gown. Maurice on vacation in Honolulu, Hawaii, on a beach with his wife. Maurice posting about getting a promotion last month, holding a plaque. I said, "Seems like he's doing just fine without you." She closed her eyes briefly. She said, "Stop." I said, "You know what I do not see in any of these photos? Any indication that he is spending his time thinking about the one that got away." I kept my tone calm, almost clinical. I said, "No posts about high school girlfriends. No wistful comments about past relationships." I closed Facebook and opened Instagram. It took only a moment to find his account there too. More pictures of his polished, professional life. More images of his genuine happiness with Monica. I said, 17,000 followers. Looks like Maurice is pretty popular. I bet if I sent him a direct message, he would remember you." She stiffened. She said, "Please do not do that." I said, "Why not? According to you, you were the love of his life. I am sure he would be thrilled to hear from you." She stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over her coffee. She said, "You are being cruel." I said, "I am being realistic." I leaned back in my chair, steadying myself. I said, "You want to know what is cruel? Telling your husband you wish you had married someone else. That is cruel." She started pacing again, her bare feet whispering across the tile. She said, "I did not mean it like that." I said, "Then how did you mean it?" She stopped by the counter, gripping the edge. She said, I feel trapped sometimes. Like my life did not turn out the way I thought it would." I said, "And whose fault is that?" She blinked. She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "What exactly have you done to make your life more exciting? What dreams have you pursued? What risks have you taken?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, like the answers dried up before they reached her lips. I said, "Because from where I sit, you have spent the last 5 years complaining about how boring everything is, but you have not actually done anything to change it. You just sit around fantasizing about a guy who clearly does not think about you at all." She said, "That is not fair." I said, "Is it not? When is the last time you suggested we try something new? When is the last time you planned a trip, or took a class, or picked up a hobby? When is the last time you did anything besides complain?" She sank back in her chair, looking small and defeated, her shoulders hunched. I softened my voice just a little. I said, "You want to know what I think? I think you're not upset because Maurice was so great. You are upset because you have realized that even he does not want you. And instead of facing that, You were trying to make it my fault. She whispered, That is not true. I said, Then prove it. Call Maurice yourself. See how excited he is to hear from you. I slid my phone across the table. Her Instagram account was already logged in from earlier, and Maurice's profile was still on the screen. She stared at the phone like it was a snake about to strike. I said, Go ahead. Send him a message. Tell him you've been thinking about him. Tell him you wish things had worked out differently. Her hand moved toward the phone and stopped a few inches away. I said, What is the matter? I thought he was the one who got away. Her eyes filled with tears. She pushed the phone back toward me and said, I cannot. I said, Why not? She swallowed hard. She said, Because. Her voice trailed off. I finished the thought for her. I said, Because you know exactly what would happen. He would either ignore you completely, or he would screenshot your message and share it with his friends as a cautionary tale about a former girlfriend who does not understand boundaries. Tears started spilling down her cheeks, but I was not feeling particularly sympathetic. I said, Here's the truth. Maurice was not the one who got away. You were the one he got away from. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner we can figure out what we are actually going to do about this marriage. I stood up and left her sitting at the kitchen table, her hands pressed over her face. I went to our bedroom to get ready for work, moving a little slower than usual, my thoughts loud and crowded. When I came back through about 20 minutes later, she was still sitting there, staring at my phone on the table like it contained her whole past and future. She did not look up when I grabbed my keys and headed out. Work that day was a blur of blinking cursor lines, buzzing phones, and server alerts. Leon Price, one of my closest coworkers, stopped by my cubicle around lunchtime. He said, Man, you look like you slept in the parking lot. I gave him a tired half-smile. I said, Rough night at home. Leon sat on the edge of my desk. He said, You and Alicia still going at it about the same stuff? I shrugged. I said, Worse. She told me she made a mistake not marrying her high school boyfriend. Leon winced. He said, That is cold. I nodded. I said, I ended up calling his mother. Turns out he thinks she is the biggest mistake he ever made. Leon let out a low whistle. He said, So, she has been chasing a man who does not even want her memory. I said, Something like that. Leon tapped the top of my monitor. He said, You know you do not have to stay in that forever, right? I did not answer, but the thought stayed with me the rest of the day. When I got home that evening, Alicia was exactly where I had left her that morning, sitting at the kitchen table. The coffee mugs were gone, replaced by a collection of used tissues and a half-eaten piece of toast. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. I set my keys down and said, How was your day? She looked up at me with a mixture of hope and desperation. She said, I have been thinking about what you said. I said, Which part? She said, About doing something to change my life. About not just complaining. I opened a refrigerator and grabbed a bottle of water, taking my time twisting off the cap. I said, And? She stood up and walked toward me, wringing her hands. She said, I want to fix this. I want to fix us. I said, Okay. How? She said, I was thinking maybe we could take that trip we talked about last year, the one to the mountains. The Smoky Mountains, remember? We could rent a cabin, disconnect from everything, go hiking, spend some quality time together. We could reconnect. I studied her face, trying to decide if she believed what she was saying. I said, You mean the same trip you shot down because it was too expensive and you said there would not be anything to do? She winced. She said, I was being negative then. I see that now. I said, Interesting timing for this revelation. She reached for my hand, but I stepped back, not ready to let her touch soften my anger. She said, Look, I know I messed up yesterday. I said terrible things, but I do not want to lose you. I said, Do you not want to lose me? Or do you not want to face the fact that your backup plan just fell through? She said, That is not what this is about. I walked past her to the living room and sat down on the couch. She followed, hovering nearby, like she was afraid to get too close and afraid to walk away. I said, Can I ask you something? She said, Of course. I said, When is the last time you actually tried to contact Maurice? The question hit her like a physical blow. She took a small step backward. She said, What do you mean? I said, I mean, all this talk about him being the one who got away suggests you have been thinking about him for a while. So when is the last time you reached out? She said, I have not. I tilted my head. I said, Have not what? Have not tried to contact him recently, or have not tried to contact him ever. She did not answer. I kept going. I said, because here's what I am wondering. Yesterday, you seemed pretty confident about how Maurice feels about you. That kind of confidence usually comes from recent information. She said, Brandon, please do not do this. I pulled out my phone again. I said, you know what? I think I will do some detective work. She said, do not. But I was already opening her Facebook profile on my phone. I had seen her scroll through it enough times to know her password. Her birthday followed by our wedding year. Not exactly creative. I said, let us see here. I scrolled through her message history. Lots of conversations with your sister. Some group messages from work. And what is this? I found what I was looking for. A message thread with Maurice King from 8 months ago. My stomach twisted, but my hand stayed steady. I said, well, here is an interesting conversation. Alicia's face went completely white. She said, stop. I kept reading. I said, your first message. Hey Maurice, I saw your post about the promotion. Congratulations. I have been thinking about you lately and wondering how you have been. Alicia lunged for the phone, but I held it out of reach. I said, his response is pretty enlightening too. Thanks. I'm doing well. Hope you are too. She said, stop reading that. I said, but it gets better. Your next message. I know this might sound weird, but I've been going through a rough patch, and I keep thinking about our time together in high school. You always made me feel so special. I looked up at her. I said, rough patch. 8 months ago, right around the time you started complaining about our marriage being boring. She whispered, it was not like that. I said, was it not? Let me keep reading. I scrolled. I said, Maurice's response. I am married now and happy. I think it is best if we do not continue this conversation. The silence in the room thickened. I said, but you did not stop there, did you? I scrolled down again. I said, your response. I understand. I just wanted you to know that I think about what we had sometimes. I hope your wife knows how lucky she is. I set the phone down on the arm of the couch and looked at her. I said, so when you told me yesterday that you made a mistake not marrying Maurice, you already knew he wanted nothing to do with you. She collapsed on a chair across from me, crying harder now, shoulders shaking. She said, I was in a bad place. I said, you want to know what really gets me? It is not even that you reached out to him. It is that you got rejected, and instead of dealing with that rejection like an adult, you came home and took it out on me. She said, I am sorry. I said, are you? Because it seems like you're only sorry you got caught. She looked up at me through her tears. She said, what do you want me to say? I said, I want you to tell me the truth. How long have you been fantasizing about Maurice? How long have you been comparing our marriage to some made-up version of what your life could have been? She wiped her nose with a tissue, her hand shaking. She said, I do not know. I said, that is not an answer. She stared at the floor. She said, maybe a year, maybe longer. I said, and in all that time, did it ever occur to you to talk to me about whatever was making you unhappy? Did it ever cross your mind to work on our actual marriage instead of escaping into some fantasy about your ex-boyfriend? She said, I did not think you would understand. I said, try me. She looked around the room like she was searching for an escape route, her eyes darting from the television to the front door to the family pictures on the wall. Photos of holidays, church events, cookouts with both our families, all black faces smiling and leaning into each other. She said, I just feel like we are roommates instead of husband and wife, like we were going through the motions. I said, and your solution was to chase after a guy who dumped you 15 years ago and wants nothing to do with you now. She winced. She said, when you say it like that, it sounds pathetic. I said, because it is pathetic. She flinched like I had slapped her. I ran my hand over my face, exhausted. I said, here is what I do not understand. You claim you want excitement and passion, but when Maurice told you to leave him alone, you did not move on to someone else. You did not join a dating app. You did not go out with friends looking for some new adventure. You just came home and decided to make me the villain in your story. She said, I was not trying to make you the villain. I said, then what were you trying to do? She did not have an answer for that. That weekend, after a night of lying awake on my brother's old couch that we kept in the basement, I decided to dig a little deeper. Not because I enjoyed watching my wife squirm, but because I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with if I was going to make any decisions. I started with LinkedIn. I typed in Maurice King, Harborview Medical, Charlotte, and there he was. Regional Sales Manager at Harborview Medical Systems. Graduated from Georgia State University in Atlanta with a business degree. Married to Monica Jackson King in 2022. The guy had built a decent life for himself. What caught my attention was his connection list. I recognized several names from our old high school, people I could reach out to without seeming like a complete stalker. I decided to start with Corey Henderson, a guy I had played basketball with in college who had also gone to high school with Maurice. Corey and I had stayed in touch over the years, mostly through social media and the occasional group chat about sports. I sent him a casual message. Hey man, saw Maurice King got married. Good for him. Have not thought about those high school days in forever. Corey responded within an hour. He wrote, yeah, Maurice is doing well. Funny you mentioned high school, though. He was just telling a bunch of us at his bachelor party about some of the crazy stuff from back then. I replied, oh yeah? Like what? Corey wrote back. He was talking about his ex who kept trying to get back in touch with him. Said she had been messaging him for years, even after he got engaged. He showed us some of the messages of the party. Pretty wild stuff. My stomach dropped. Years. Not just the 8 months of messages I'd already seen, but years. I typed, that is rough. Some people just cannot let go, I guess. Corey replied, tell me about it. Maurice said she even tried to friend his mom on Facebook. His mom told her to stop contacting the family. He was pretty embarrassed about the whole thing. I set my phone down and walked to the kitchen, where Alicia was making lunch. She was cutting tomatoes for a salad, the knife moving slowly. She looked up hopefully when I entered. She said, hey, want something to eat? I said, how long? She frowned. She said, how long what? I said, how long have you been trying to contact Maurice? Her face went pale again. She said, we already talked about this. I said, Corey Henderson says Maurice told his friends at his bachelor party that you have been messaging him for years. Even tried to contact his mother. The knife slipped from her fingers and clattered against the cutting board. She whispered, that is not true. I said, so Corey is lying? Maurice is lying? His mother is lying. She leaned against the counter like her legs might give out. She said, it was not like that. I said, then what was it like? She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She said, I reached out a few times over the years, just to see how he was doing. I said a few times, maybe more than a few. And his mother. She said, I sent her a friend request once. I thought maybe she would want to stay in touch. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I said, you tried to connect with your ex-boyfriend's mother. She said, it seemed innocent at the time. I said, when was this? She said, 2 years ago, maybe 3. I said, while you were married to me. She said, it was not romantic. I was just curious. I said, and when she told you to stop contacting the family? Alicia did not answer. I stepped closer, my voice low. I said, she did tell you to stop, did she not? Alicia finally nodded. She said it would be better if I did not reach out anymore. I said, and you kept trying anyway. She said, not with her, just with Maurice. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through her Facebook messages again, this time going back further. I said, here we go. I read aloud. I said, 3 years ago. Hey Maurice, I know it has been a while, but I saw your post about starting the new job. So proud of you. I scrolled. 2.5 years ago. Maurice, I had a dream about you last night. Is that not weird? Made me think about our senior year. Alicia whispered, please stop reading those. I kept going. I said, 2 years ago. I know I probably should not be writing this, but I miss talking to you. I miss how you used to make me laugh. I looked up at her. I said, you were stalking him. She said, I was not stalking anyone. I said, what would you call it? You have been harassing this man for years, trying to reconnect with his family, sending him inappropriate messages while he is engaged to someone else. Tears started flowing again, steady and silent. She said, I was not trying to hurt anyone. I said, then what were you trying to do? Break up his relationship? Get him to leave his fiancée for you? She said, I just wanted to know if he ever thought about me. I said, he told you he did not, multiple times, but you kept pushing. She said, I thought maybe if I could just explain how I felt. I cut her off. I said, explain what? That you were unhappy in your marriage and looking for an escape? That you were willing to wreck his relationship to make yourself feel better. She sank into a chair, sobbing openly now. I said, "You want to know the worst part? It is not even that you were chasing after him. It is that you were so delusional about it. You actually convinced yourself that he wanted you back, that he was just playing hard to get." She said, "I thought maybe he was confused." I said, "He was not confused. He was disgusted and embarrassed. Embarrassed enough to tell his friends about you at his bachelor party." That seemed to hit her harder than anything else I'd said. Her shoulders shook as she cried. I said, "They were all laughing about it, were they not? Maurice and his friends, sitting around, making jokes about the former girlfriend who would not take no for an answer." She put her head in her hands. I said, "So when you told me you made a mistake not marrying Maurice, you already knew he thought you were a mistake. You already knew he would rather tell embarrassing stories about you than give you 5 minutes of his time." She choked out, "I am sorry." I said, "Sorry for what? Sorry you got caught? Sorry Maurice did not want you? Sorry you spent years making a fool of yourself?" She said, "Sorry for all of it." I stood up and looked down at her, feeling more tired than angry now. I said, "The question now is what we're going to do about it." She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I mean, this marriage was already hanging by a thread before I found out you've been stalking your ex-boyfriend for 3 years. Now I find out you have been lying to me about it, lying to yourself about it, and apparently providing entertainment for Maurice's friends. That is a lot to come back from." She looked up at me with panic in her eyes. She said, "Are you leaving me?" I said, "I am thinking about it." She rushed to her feet. She said, "Please do not. I will do whatever it takes to fix this. I will delete Facebook. I will block Maurice on everything. I will never contact him again." I said, "You already tried that. He blocked you first." The look on her face told me I had guessed correctly. I said, "When was that? After his bachelor party? After his friends started commenting on his posts, asking about the former girlfriend?" She whispered, "After that, yes." I said, "So you humiliated him publicly?" She said, "I did not mean to." I said, "But you did. And now you want me to pretend none of this happened and go back to being your backup plan while you figure out your next fantasy." She said, "That is not what I want." I said, "Then what do you want?" She looked around the kitchen like the answer might be written on the walls somewhere. Finally, she said, "I do not know." I grabbed my car keys. I said, "Well, when you figure it out, let me know. I will be at my brother's place." My younger brother, Damien, lived about 20 minutes away in a modest townhouse he had been renting for the past 5 years. He was 3 years younger than me, worked as a mechanic, and had never been married. He also had zero tolerance for drama, which made him the perfect person to talk to. He handed me a beer and sat down across from me in his living room, the sound of a basketball game murmuring from the television. He said, "Let me get this straight. Alicia has been chasing this dude for 3 years, got rejected repeatedly, embarrassed him in front of his friends, and then blamed you for her boring life." I said, "That is the short version." Damien raised his eyebrows. He said, "And you were wondering if you should leave her?" I stared at the label on my bottle. I said, "I am wondering if there is any way to come back from this." Damien took a long drink, then leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He said, "You know what I think? I think you already know the answer. You just do not want to admit it." I said, "Maybe." He said, "How long have you two been having problems, really?" I sighed. I said, "Honestly, probably since the beginning. But I kept thinking it would get better once we got past money problems, once we got past the apartment, once we got the house, once I got promoted." I kept moving the goal line. Damien shook his head. He said, "When people show you who they are, believe them the first time." I snorted. I said, "That sounds like something Mom would say." He smiled faintly. He said, "Mom was smart about people. Remember what she used to say about Dad's ex-girlfriends when they would call the house?" A memory surfaced of our mother, apron on, rolling her eyes while the phone rang. She would say, "Some people cannot stand to see other people happy." Damien pointed at me. He said, "Exactly. And that is what Alicia is. She cannot stand to see Maurice happy with someone else. And she cannot stand to see you content with your life either." My phone buzzed with a text message from Alicia. "Please come home. We need to talk." I showed Damien the message. He said, "You going back tonight?" I said, "I do not know." He said, "Well, you are welcome to stay here as long as you need. Guest bedroom is all yours." I nodded, grateful. Later that night, Around 10 o'clock, my phone started ringing. It was her sister, Tanisha. I stepped out onto Damien's back porch before answering. I said, "Hey." Tanisha did not waste time. She said, "What in the world is going on? Alicia has been calling me, crying for the past 2 hours, saying you left her." I said, "Did she tell you why?" Tanisha said, "Something about a fight you had." She was not making much sense. I said, "Did she mention Maurice King?" There was a long pause. Tanisha finally said, "Oh no." I said, "Oh yes." Tanisha sighed. She said, "She has been talking about him again, has she not?" I said, "Again? How often does she bring him up to you?" Tanisha hesitated, then said, "Look, I love my sister, but she has had this weird obsession with that guy for years. Every time something goes wrong in her life, she starts talking about how different things would be if she had stayed with him." I pinched the bridge of my nose. I said, "And you never thought to mention this to me?" Tanisha said, "I figured it was just talk. Harmless fantasy stuff. I did not think she would actually try to contact him after you got married." I said, "Well, it turns out it was not so harmless. She's been trying to contact him for 3 years. Even tried to friend his mother on Facebook." Tanisha gasped. She said, "Are you serious?" I said, "Dead serious." And apparently Maurice was so annoyed by it that he told his friends about it at his bachelor party. Tanisha said, "Oh my God. She is going to be mortified when she finds out people know." I said, "She already knows." That is when Maurice finally blocked her. Tanisha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I honestly do not know. But I'm not going home tonight." She said, "Do you want me to talk to her?" I said, "What would you say?" Tanisha said, "That she's an idiot and she is about to lose a good man over some fantasy about a man who clearly wants nothing to do with her." I said, "Feel free." After I hung up, I sat on Damien's porch for a while, listening to distant traffic and a neighbor's dog barking, trying to let my thoughts settle. My phone kept buzzing with messages from Alicia, but I did not open them. Around midnight, it rang again. This time it was my father-in-law. I hesitated for a second, then answered. He said, "Brandon, is everything all right? Alicia called here upset, saying you had left." I said, "We are having some marriage troubles." He said, "Anything I can help with?" I actually like my father-in-law. He is a straight shooter who has always treated me with respect. I said, "She told me she wished she had married her ex-boyfriend instead of me." He said, "What?" "Maurice King." I said, "Her high school boyfriend, yes." There was a long pause on the line. Then he said, "That son of a..." "Excuse me." "Not you. Maurice. That little punk has been nothing but trouble for years." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "She used to call the house asking about him when you two first got married. Wanted to know if we ever heard from his family. Her mother told her to let it go, but she would not listen." I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. I said, "She was asking about Maurice when we were newlyweds?" He said, "First year you were married. Maybe the second year too. We thought it was just curiosity, but made us uncomfortable." I said, "So she has been obsessing over him since the beginning of our marriage." He sighed. He said, "Sounds like it. Look, I love my daughter, but she has always had a problem accepting reality when it does not match what she wants." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "She used to do the same thing in high school. If a boy broke up with her, she would convince herself he was just confused or going through a phase. She would keep trying to get back together until the poor kid had to change his schedule to avoid her." I said, "Maurice was not the first guy she stalked." He said, "No, but he was the most persistent case. Even after she started dating you, she would bring him up in conversation, ask if anyone had heard anything about him." I swallowed hard. I said, "Why did no one tell me?" He said, "We hoped marriage would settle her down, help her focus on the future instead of the past." I said, "Well, it did not work." He said, "No, it did not. I'm sorry about that, Brandon. You deserve better than this." After that conversation, I went back inside and told Damien I would be staying for a few days. He just nodded and said, "Good call." Let her sit with her choices for a while. The next morning, I woke up to a string of missed calls and messages. One of them was from a buddy at work. Leon said, "Dude, what is going on?" Riley from Human Resources called me asking weird questions about Alicia. I called him back. Leon said, "She was asking if I knew anything about Alicia messaging some guy for years. Said somebody mentioned it might be affecting your home life." I rubbed my forehead. I said, "Word travels fast." Leon said, "So it is true?" I said, "Unfortunately." He said, "Man, that is messed up. I am sorry." I said, "Yeah. Well, at least now I know where I stand." Leon said, "You need anything? Place to stay? Somebody to talk to?" I said, "I am good for now. I am at Damien's." Leon said, "All right. Just do not disappear on us." By noon, my phone was buzzing constantly. Her friends, my friends, cousins, church members, people who had heard bits and pieces of the story and the way drama always finds a way to spread. The whole thing was turning into a small town-style circus, even though we lived in a mid-sized city. But the most interesting call came from someone I did not expect. Monica King, Maurice's wife. Her name popped up on my phone after an unknown number left a voicemail saying she needed to speak with me. When I answered, her voice was calm but tight. She said, "Hi, Brandon. This is Monica King. I know this is going to sound strange, but I think we need to talk." I said, "Monica, yes, I know who you are." She said, "Your wife has been harassing my husband for years. I wanted you to know that we are considering a restraining order." I had no idea how bad it was until this week. I said, "I did not know it was that bad either until recently." Monica said, "Maurice showed me everything. The messages, the attempts to contact his family, even the fake social media accounts she created when he blocked her. I am sorry, but this is serious." My head spun. I said, "Fake accounts." There was more I had not known about. For a second, I just stood there in Damien's hallway, staring at the blank wall. Then I said, "I am filing for divorce." I told her this marriage is over. Monica exhaled audibly. She said, "Good. Because if she contacts him again, we're taking legal action." I said, "I understand. She will not." Monica said, "For whatever it is worth, I am sorry you got pulled into this." We hung up, and I just stood there, phone in hand, feeling oddly calm. That evening, I drove back home to get my things. The house felt different as soon as I stepped inside, like it was holding its breath. Alicia was waiting in the living room with packed suitcases by the door. She had on jeans and a hoodie, her hair pulled back, her eyes still swollen. She said, "I am leaving. I'm going to stay with my sister for a while." I closed the door behind me and set my keys on the table. I said, "Running away will not fix this." She said, "There is nothing to fix. You have made it clear you do not want to work on our marriage." I said, "Work on what?" "Your obsession with a man who is considering a restraining order against you." Her face went white again. She said, "What?" I said, "His wife called me. Apparently, you have been creating fake accounts to message him. They are talking to a lawyer." She sat down heavily on the edge of the couch. She said, "I never meant for it to go this far." I said, "But it did. And now you get to live with the consequences." She said, "What about us?" I shook my head. I said, "There is no us. There probably never was. You have been living in a fantasy for years." She picked up her suitcases and stood, the wheels bumping against the hardwood. She said, "So that is it. 7 years of marriage, and you're just giving up." I said, "You gave up 7 years ago when you decided I was not good enough. I just did not know it yet." She said, "I never said that." I said, "You did not have to. Every time you talked about Maurice, every message you sent him, every time you compared our life to some imaginary alternative, you said it." She stood there for a moment, her eyes searching my face for any sign that I might change my mind. When she did not find one, she reached for the doorknob. She turned back and said, "For what it is worth, I am sorry." I looked at her and said, "I believe you, but sorry does not fix anything." She nodded once, opened the door, and walked out, pulling her suitcases behind her. The sound of them rolling down the front steps echoed for a second, then faded. After she left, I sat in the quiet house and felt something I had not experienced in years. Peace. No pacing footsteps, no pointed sighs, no cold silences over dinner. Just the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing outside. 3 months later, the divorce was final. Alicia did not try to fight it. She signed the papers without a scene, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. Last I heard, she had moved to another state and was working at a dental office reception desk. Maurice and Monica never had to file that restraining order. Apparently, the threat was enough. As for me, I am doing fine. Better than fine, actually. It turns out that when you are not constantly walking on eggshells around someone who wishes they were somewhere else, life gets a lot more enjoyable. I kept the house. I got a promotion at work. I started spending more time with my family and friends, reconnecting with people outside the shadow of Alicia's moods. Eventually, I started dating someone who actually wants to be with me, who looks at me and sees a partner, not a consolation prize. Sometimes people ask if I regret not trying harder to save the marriage. They ask if I think we could have made it work with counseling or a trip or a fresh start somewhere new. But the answer is simple. You cannot save something that was never actually there to begin with. Alicia wanted Maurice. Maurice wanted nothing to do with her. And I refuse to spend the rest of my life as anyone's backup, anyone's safety net, anyone's second choice. I may not have the most exciting job in the world. I may not be the center of anybody's wild high school memories. But I know my worth now. I know what I bring to a relationship. And one thing I know for certain is this. I will never again stay with someone who treats my life like the life they settled for. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.